Students, this is Module 35, the History and Alternative Views of Macro. I would say this is usually not really too testable. It's kind of some review stuff. There's some history stuff, but when you're looking at things, this is kind of a nice to know section, but we will put all the graphs together in this section, so not bad to look at. As we're looking at Module 35, what we need to do, you're going to look at classical economists versus like Keynesian economists. So you can definitely read this part about like money and the price level in Module 35. What you're going to see is how the classical people view the short run effects as basically unimportant. What they really think is the long run is the only spot that matters. So when you're looking at the long run, of course, you're just looking at this long run aggregate supply curve. And it doesn't matter to a classical economist if you're in a recessionary gap or inflationary gap for a while, because they're like, hey, it's all going to come back to long run anyway. Whereas Keynes had the very famous quote that was, in the long run, we're all dead. So why don't we fix some of the stuff now if we can? If you're looking at classic economists in the business cycle, they really have no theory of the business cycle. It's just, hey, sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. Don't worry about it because potential GDP it's always going to come back, and we don't have to worry about what's happening in that actual GDP. If it goes up, it's going to come down. If it's down, it's going to come up. It just is what it is. Mr. Clifford has a really nice little chart on this, or a little graph on this, and I can demonstrate it for you here, where he kind of puts all these things together. It's a pretty decent way to go. So basically, if you look at putting all the graphs together in this section, if I'm here in my long run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, you can see at this point right here, point A, we are in a recessionary gap. Now that I know I'm in a recessionary gap from the very beginning, I can now say, oh, I know something about the Phillips curve. And in the Phillips curve, I know that in a recessionary gap, I'm going to have some unemployment going on, and I'm also going to be having not as much inflation. So if I know that I'm not going to have inflation, and I know I have more unemployment, I'm going to be over here on my short run Phillips curve. I also know that if I'm having this sort of gap here, I realize, oh, where should I be on the business cycle? Well, if I'm in a recession on the business cycle, I'm going to be someplace like this on the bottom of the business cycle. And what that also is telling me on my production possibility curve is, because I have this unemployment and I know things aren't going so well for me, I'm going to be actually inside my production possibility curve. Now, as things change, as things start to happen, you can see adjustments occur. So for example, let's say aggregate demand shifted to the right. If aggregate demand shifted to the right here, and I now have a point B at AD2 at full employment, well, on my Phillips curve, what's going to happen? I'm going to move up my Phillips curve to right here, where I'm going to have a little inflation occur, but at the same time, I'm also going to have more people employed. So I'm going to have less unemployment. What's going to happen on my business cycle? Well, that spot would be, if we're moving forward in time, it would probably be like here on my list, right? So we went from A to B. I went from having this little bit of a, gap here in terms of a recession. Now, I'm right on my potential GDP. And here on my production possibility curve, I am now here on my line. And remember, this line is going to be like, some percentage of unemployment. Typically, we'd say like 5% unemployment, something like that. Maybe it's a little lower than that in today's world, but that's usually typical. If we go one step further and I say, oh man, let's say aggregate demand went so far as to be in something like this, aggregate demand 3, and I now have a point, over here at point C. I am now in an inflationary gap. In my inflationary gap, I'm going to have hardly any unemployment, but my price level is going to be way up here, right? So when that happens on my Phillips curve, I'm going to see hardly any unemployment, but I'm definitely going to see some inflation. We're going to see that increase there. On my business cycle, it would be, well, I'm now on the top of my business cycle up here someplace, right? And in my production possibility curve, I'm actually beyond 5%. I'm like at, let's say, 3% unemployment, and my point might be someplace out here. So when you look at all three of these graphs put together, this is kind of this section where you're like, okay, what are all the things I know about macroeconomics? Can I put them all together? Yeah, you can. And you can see where those points are. Mr. Clifford goes through that little thing on this video here. As you look through the rest of this section, we see a little bit about John Maynard Keynes, where he starts talking about those shifts in aggregate supply, shifts in aggregate demand. What can we do? Remember, what he really focused on is the aggregate demand. Like, could we move aggregate demand to the point where we don't have those recessionary gaps anymore, and instead we can always get back to full employment? When you think about, the classical theory, basically the role of money was, wow, if we had, it's not going to matter because we're just going to end up in the long run anyway. Whereas Keynes' view, and some people called it the animal spirits, it was sort of the business cycle, how businesses felt. If the businesses felt positive, then of course they're going to invest, etc. If they felt negative, they're going to take some of that away. So those animal spirits are unpredictable, but typically it's businesses and their ideas for investment. A business confidence, if you will. So when you start looking at the classical theory, in the classical theory, you can see like this is just, like what's going to happen. Our aggregate demand might go, but we're not going to look at this point over here. We're just going to drop right along our long run aggregate supply curve here. Whereas Keynes said, no, you can't just drop down. There's going to be this little point over here before we get back to here. That's what we have to focus on. There's people that said, hey, maybe Keynes isn't right. You can go look up things like by Milton Friedman. That's in your textbook. He's like a monetarist here. Again, Mr. Clifford has a nice little video on that. As you look at monetarism, basically what they said is as GDP grows, as the money supply grows, that's what's going to happen. The more money you add into the system, your GDP is going to grow that little bit. So as long as you keep adding a little bit of money, your GDP is going to grow a little bit. And any other policy that you'd put in terms of like a discretionary policy, you shouldn't do it. Instead, just keep adding a little bit of money all the time and your GDP is going to grow just fine. This velocity of money is definitely a testable thing. Velocity of money is just how often that dollar turns over. If the dollar turns over quite a bit, then you know that the velocity is pretty high. Like that means the dollar is getting spent more often. It means people are pretty confident they're going to take that money and they're just going to keep respending it. When it's low, again, it's their confidence isn't there and they just sort of spend. And if you get erratic, that's where that whole idea of monetarism kind of falls apart, because if sometimes it's like getting turned over quickly, sometimes it's slowly. If you can't really predict by putting money into the system, then that really doesn't work. So monetarism's ideas there are kind of suspect a little bit if you get erratic velocity. Challenges to Keynes, I don't know. The natural rate of unemployment is pretty much, like they said, accepted in your slide here. Stagflation, did that prove that maybe, Keynes is right? I don't know. As you look at it even now, we have, like, lots of people are Keynesians now, where they are, hey, the economy's not doing so good. We need to do something. We need to throw some cash into the system. What is some Keynesian problems? Election day economics is certainly one of them. You get politicians who are like, oh man, I need to do something right now so that I can get some cash in the system so I get reelected. Or, oh, the business cycle is not doing so well, but it's an election year. I need to do something. And that's why the central bank needs to be independent, and you can't have this constant pressure on the central bank to do something, because then they start acting in some sort of weird, erratic way, and then it's all bets are off. You're not doing the right thing for the economy because you're getting too much political pressure. As you look at some of these other things, you can read about new Keynesians, but I don't think there's nothing testable in here. It's just interesting theories, I guess, if you will, on how the economy works. This chart kind of shows classicals, Keynesians, and monetarists, and you can kind of see, oh, this is what they think should happen in terms of fiscal policy or monetary policy. You can look up that too. And the last thing you should do is you definitely should click on these videos, Keynes versus Hayek. Hayek is more of that classical vein. Keynesian obviously is going to be more tax, and spend. And it's the Fear the Boom and the Bust. The video is going to look like this. It's really pretty funny. It's a rap about economics. So who wouldn't love that? That should be it for this section. Thanks.